Greetings and welcome. I am Justavor, bringing what I hope is constructive information on what the system of racism is and how it works, as well as what can be done to replace it with a system of justice. For more information on the purpose and goals of this channel, as well as some basic definitions of words and terms we use in reference to our work, I have included a link below to a video containing this information. In this video, I will be discussing the central motivations behind the practice of racism by those who classify themselves as white, as per the research and writings of the grandsester, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. Before beginning, I think it would be best to start by giving a brief background on Dr. Welsing herself. Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, born on March 18, 1935, was a third-generation psychiatrist who earned her bachelor's degree from Antioch College in Ohio in 1957 and her medical degree in child psychiatry from Howard University in 1962, where she also served as an assistant professor. Her father, Henry Cress, and grandfather were both medical doctors, and her mother, Ida, was an educator. Her upbringing was central to her educational and professional paths. Dr. Welsing spent many years in the 1960s working at hospitals, especially children's hospitals. These encounters led to Dr. Welsing's research and work in understanding the system of white supremacy, racism, and its effects. In 1969, she wrote her first paper on the findings of her research on racism, titled The Cress Theory of Color-Confrontation and Racism, White Supremacy, which she self-published in 1970. In 1991, she published her decades of research in the form of a number of papers compiled into a single book, which was entitled The ISIS Papers, The Keys to the Colors. Dr. Francis Cress Welsing spent many years following the publishing of the ISIS Papers, expounding on, clarifying, and defending her research with varying responses from the general public. Dr. Welsing acknowledged as her inspiration the work of Mr. Neely Fuller Jr. and his United Independent Compensatory Code System concept, also known as the Counter-Racist Code. While videos of Mr. Fuller speaking on his work are rare, as he often appears and hosts radio programs expounding on the code, there are many videos of Dr. Welsing online that I encourage those interested to view. I would note that I think Dr. Welsing's ISIS Papers works best as a complement to Mr. Fuller's code book. I would also remind people that one of Dr. Welsing's most referenced quotes by attempted counter-racists is that reading is more important than watching television. Dr. Welsing transitioned to the ancestral plane on January 2nd, 2016, after an admirable lifelong effort to counter the global system of white supremacy with a system of justice. This video is intended to serve as an introduction to those unfamiliar with the grandsester, Dr. Welsing's background and works, as I recognize her lifelong dedication to sufficiently analyzing and succinctly defining the problem of white supremacy, racism, and assisting victims of racism to not only understand the problem of racism, but to effectively neutralize this most monstrous form of injustice and chaos. I also recognize that Dr. Welsing's work and legacy is constructive towards replacing the global system of white supremacy with a system of justice. It is my hope that this work that I am doing will honor her life and legacy. What is the Cress theory of color confrontation and racism, white supremacy? Let's let the grandsester speak for herself.
In the late 1960s, I wrote a paper on racism. The paper was really written for fellow colleagues in psychiatry because we were looking at racism. If you remember, 20 years ago, people were having black caucuses and looking at the issue of racism during the civil rights era. And so I put down my thoughts about racism. And I entitled the paper that I wrote, The Cress Theory of Color Confrontation and Racism, in parentheses, White Supremacy. Cress is my maiden name. And so I entitled the paper that. But basically, I looked at racism as a behavioral dynamic that came about because the white population in the world is a tiny minority population. It is also a genetic recessive population in terms of skin coloration. And so I looked at racism as behavior that evolved when this minority population that was genetic recessive found itself in a world on a planet in which the vast majority of the people, black, brown, red, and yellow, are not only the numerical majority, but they are genetically dominant in terms of skin coloration and could potentially cause white genetic annihilation. And so if the white population consciously or subconsciously desired to survive genetically speaking, do you see, and not be, well, I think sometimes they use the terms mongrelization of the races, but genetic annihilation is the terminology that I use, then that would require that the white population hold in oppression all of the non-white people on the planet, black, brown, red, and yellow people. Now, of all of the non-white people, black people have the greatest genetic potential to cause white genetic annihilation. And so when we were children, we learned, if you're black, stay back, brown, stick around, yellow, mellow, white, right. Now, those are the gradations of the genetic production of this black pigment melanin. And so the more melanin you have, the greater threat to the fear of white genetic annihilation. So that's the way that I understand racism. And racism is not something that is just operative at the economic level. That racism, to use the terminology of a gentleman named Neely Fuller, who has also written about racism, that it is operative in all areas of people activity: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. In other words, there are behaviors that are carried out across the board in all areas of people activity to prevent white genetic annihilation or to maintain white genetic survival.
The response to Dr. Welsing's work was not always that of welcome. After publishing her theory of color confrontation and racism, she was removed from her post at Howard University, a notable HBCU, meaning historic black colleges and universities. What was the typical response of those in power, the people who classify themselves as white? I think a proper example would be in these clips from when Dr. Welsing appeared on the Phil Donahue show.
Racism, white supremacy. To be sure, a provocative and controversial theory on skin color and oppression. Well, I'm ready. So is this mostly but not exclusively white audience. Let them have it, Doctor. How? Boy, oh boy, do you need an escort to get out of your speeches?
No, now, let me just give you a little background. This paper was written approximately in 1969 and presented in 1970. It was written for a group of black psychiatrists who were looking at racism.
Yeah.
It was also written because as a psychiatrist and working in a hospital trying to treat black people and white people, but recognizing that the majority of the problems that black patients had in a psychiatric hospital, when you took a history, you would run smack into racism. So I knew I had to understand racism to help solve the mental health problems of black people. Okay. So out of my brain computer, putting in the question, why? Why do we see this behavior? Why have we seen it for hundreds of years? So I thought about these two things, basically two facts, that even though the white population says that people of color are minorities, that it is the white population that is the minority, the minority on the planet.
That's the reality you're saying.
That's the reality.
Yeah.
That in spite of the fact that black people, non-white people have heard over and over again, you're genetically inferior because you are non-white. That in reality, white skin is a genetic recessive status, not as said by Cress Welsing. You see, meaning that if
if you and I were to have a baby, the baby would have color, and you make the contribution and I don't.
That white plus colored. Well, wait a minute. It's not Cress Welsing that is concerned about the disappearance of white. Ben Wattenberg just wrote a book, The Birth Dearth. There have been multiple articles in the newspaper talking about the decline of Western populations.
Yeah, here's the Washington Post, just to name one. We are a depopulation bomb, the withering of the Western world. Here, incidentally, this was the percentage of the West's population in 1900, the turn of this century. About 30%. This is where we'll be less than 10% in the year 2075. Here's where we are about today, 15. So we're not having babies.
So whites are not having babies, and there is the concern about white genetic annihilation. In other words, I look at, this is Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday holiday, and people will say, well, here's a man who talked about love. Yeah. Why was he killed? And I say that the deeper logic is, what if all black and white people and non-white people and white people love? What would happen to white people? White would disappear. You see, just mix all of the people on the planet up together.
In other words, if race didn't matter, or if color didn't matter, it follows with the jet planes.
No, I'm not saying if it didn't matter. I'm saying that indeed if there was a mingling of all of the people, because
that's what I'm saying.
Okay, fine.
Absence of prejudice.
The ability, no, wait, don't confuse what I'm saying. I'm saying that if we mixed all of the people presently on the planet, stirred them up,
the white freckle-faced people would be gone.
Genetic recessive status would disappear. And that if I did a survey and everybody didn't have to, face anybody, if I said how many people who are white want their children to be white, want their grandchildren to be white, want their great-grandchildren to be white, want their great-great-grandchildren to be white. And I've gone all over the country in England and asked this question. Yeah. Everybody wants the children and the generations to remain white. Yes. If you do, then you have to do something to make sure that that happens. And I say that what the thing is that is done, and particularly in relationship to black non-whites, because we have the greatest genetic potential to cause white genetic annihilation.
Because you're the blackest.
Because we, right.
The most color.
Right. We have this ability to produce melanin pigment. We have more of it than anybody else. And so the most pressure is on black people. As a matter of fact, the black people learn, all non-white people over the world learn. If you're black, stay back. If you're yellow, you're brown, stick around. If you're yellow, mellow, white, right. I can go to England and the people can just say the same thing. Doesn't matter whether if you go to the Philippines, because there has been a confrontation of brown with white. Everybody knows the more pigment you have, the more pressure that is on you. Yeah. But they didn't understand why. I say the why is for the purpose of white genetic survival.
Right.
Regardless of the public responses to Dr. Welsing's work, she continued to learn more about the system of racism and what must be done to produce a system of justice. Dr. Welsing, at many times, demonstrated the effectiveness of the counter-racist code and how she treated others and how she treated herself. Take a look at this clip from her 1970s debate with the suspected racist William Shockley on Tony Brown's Journal.
When I first met Dr. Welsing, it was not black students who were disrupting, but white students. And Dr. Welsing made a very sincere and I thought extremely effective effort, a well-planned effort. It was not effective with these white students at Staten Island Community College, so I would have a chance to speak. In fact, I think they prevented her from saying what she wanted to say when she was trying to gain me a platform. So my main theme is that we have problems that we should face and we should look at connected with dysgenics. And I welcome any opportunity I have to bring this out so that people can look at it and worry about it.
Dr. Shockley, you are accused of having a theory that is a white racist theory.
I would like to note that Dr. Shockley mentioned that it was the white students who prevented him from speaking at the university, and that Dr. Welsing welcomed the dialogue and advocated for it, but ultimately was not listened to by those white students. What was the basis for Dr. Shockley's work?
My research leads me, and it's a tragic conclusion really, my research leads me inescapably to the opinion that the major cause of the American Negro's intellectual and social deficits is hereditary and racially genetic in origin, and thus not remediable to a major degree by practical improvements in environment.
All right, if you believe that the position relatively of black Americans to white Americans is based on a genetic inferiority, and I will accept the responsibility for that word, then what do you see as the solution to the problem?
Well, I see the first aspect of this is to prevent the problem from becoming worse by dysgenics. This first word
Would
that
you
I
translate
mentioned.
dysgenics for me and the audience?
What I
Would that
meant
be
is
sterilization?
No. Dysgenics, you see, means what that other chart I showed you says.
Should blacks,
the least effective element.
Should blacks be sterilized?
No. I have a...
But if blacks are a problem and we do not allow...
This is inhumane. And
Dr.
I think one can find more humane solutions to this.
Well, then how would... Then
I would propose something in which one of the key phrases is regardless of sex, race, or welfare status. And this is the proposal. I call it a thinking exercise. It's mentioned in that pamphlet that I showed that you can obtain. And it goes this way, that you would offer a bonus to everyone to be sterilized. Now, we know we have a population explosion problem. We know that in India that bonuses in the form of transistor radios are offered to people.
Would this bonus be directed to black people specifically, more than whites?
Mr. Brown, what did I say just a moment ago? I said, regardless of sex, race, or welfare status.
Now, there is a group...
Dr. Shockley.
There is a group
that's what I say.
There is a group of white people to whom this offer should be made also.
Absolutely.
What
Now,
the
offer is based upon the best estimates, best scientific estimates that one can have of any genetically carried disabilities. Now, there are some, I think, that any humane person would have no doubt about. And Dr. Welsing talked about dominant and recessive genes. I want to point out that sometimes a dominant gene can be a very bad thing, and it is a very bad thing for a neurological disease called Huntington's chorea, which is something like multiple sclerosis.
Which is more prominent in white people than black people.
That is correct.
Now, why would those white students not want this debate to happen? My informed opinion is that one of the ways racists practice racism is to deny the problem that is the system of white supremacy, or the severity of the problem, thus deceiving and causing confusion in the minds of the victims of racism. The debate on Tony Brown's journal was an opportunity to see Dr. Welsing's theory against those of a suspected white race soldier such as Dr. William Shockley, as seen in this clip.
Go ahead, your Unblack Journal, please.
What we know about ancient black civilizations, how can American blacks suddenly be genetically regressive?
Thank you.
Let me just say this. What is very interesting is in the study of biology, biologists who have studied evolution, one of the very interesting things that they say is that the more functional skin pigment cells in the animal kingdom, the higher you are on the scale of phylogenetic ascension. In other words, nature in the course of evolution went to its highest state when it produced a cell that could produce pigment, and that we were sliding backwards. The mutation to albinism is a step backwards in the scale of evolution. Are you aware of that, Dr. Shockley?
No, I'm not aware of that particular one. I am aware of another basic genetic difference, and that is that the rate of maturation of a neurological system gets longer and longer the more advanced the animal is. And that is one of the items on the racial difference, that the neurological development of blacks is faster than whites. Black babies walk on the average a month earlier than white babies. And the period of
black
gestation...
people are much more creative also than white.
Dr. Wells,
I would like to revisit Dr. Welsing's appearance on the Phil Donahue show, as well as this debate, and possibly the follow-up with Dr. William Shockley. As we can see, Dr. Welsing exhibits quite well the effectiveness of the counter-racist code, as well as black intelligence and black self-respect. It is my opinion that one of the most constructive principles of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing's work is her principle of black self-respect. While researching Dr. Welsing's work by reading her papers and viewing videos of her online, I would like to note that Dr. Welsing appeared over 30 times on the radio program, The Context of White Supremacy with Gus T. Renegade. I encourage listening to those programs, as well as Dr. Welsing going into great detail regarding her work and views on the system of white supremacy and black self-respect. As we bring this video to a close, I would like to end with sharing Dr. Welsing's A Liberating Black People's Prayer. Thou who art blacker than a trillion midnights, whose eyes shine brighter than a billion suns. Thou whose hair doth coil tighter than a million springs, radiating all energy throughout the universe. We beseech thee, one and only one, to give us total strength to carry out thy will for the universe, to establish justice on planet Earth and live in peace. If you would like an even better understanding of the code and how it works, please visit producejustice.com to order the United Independent Compensatory Code System Concept by Neely Fuller Jr. I receive no proceeds from the sales of Produce Justice or any of the works I have mentioned in this video. I think that the works of Mr. Fuller Jr. are constructive, and his books act as guides to getting and keeping on code. To view a video of Mr. Fuller explaining the basics of the code, I have included a link in the description for the interview by Danny Queen when Mr. Fuller appeared on Color Me Poetry. If you feel this content is constructive and worth your time and energy, please subscribe to support the making of more content in the future. I am Justavor, and I am still learning. Thank you for watching. Until next time.
Well, Shockley, correct me if I'm incorrect. Didn't the Giselle schedule, which tested the intelligence of children, make a correlative between intelligence and walking early?
Yes.
And I would think it probably would have been negative.
No, it was not.
positive.
It was positive.
Well,
The motor skills on the Giselle schedule indicated that earlier precocious walking children, there was a correlation between that and high intelligence.
This may be true. It might be true within a group. I'm not sure of that.
Well, maybe
I know that there is a correlation in terms of things earlier than walking. In this, at the 6-month stage, Nancy Bailey at Berkeley has established that white children who come from the most advanced families and who later, when they become older, are out at the top. At the first 6 months, they are relatively retarded compared to children who are from families of less accomplishment and who don't go as far. But this, so there are a number of these things certainly to be brought in.
Fine.
But this
Giselle schedule is a very authentic, accepted, institutional, psychological experiment.
And so is the Nancy Bailey early.